Well, good evening, everybody. Welcome to this Sunday evening lecture that is very appropriate for this season of Advent, as we have parishioner Angela Mack, who is Executive Director of the Gibbs Museum here in Charleston, will be talking to us this evening about images of Mary in art and iconography. And following our time together, Parishioner Vicki Anthos has prepared a little reception in Stevens Hall that you are all welcome to come back to for some conversation. I also just want to know that now that we are just about clear from our church's bicentennial, over the last year we've had a number of educational lectures and roundtables focused on our congregation's history. I am looking forward to moving back to monthly lectures that are focused on the intersection of faith and spirituality with art and culture, as we did prior to the pandemic. I'm very happy to say that our next lecture will be Sunday, January 8th at 5 p.m. It will be by scholar Harlan Green, and this is Harlan's description of his lecture, a brief summary of LGBTQ life in Charleston from the time before colonization to the first Pride March. It's part of an ongoing project to document the queer past and present centered in the Addlestone Library at the College of Charleston. Green's new book is The Real Rainbow Row Explorations in Charleston's LGBTQ History. So that's January 8th at 5 p.m. Please mark your calendars for that. And before I invite Angela up, let's just have a word of prayer to begin the evening. Let us pray. Good and gracious God, we give you thanks for the gift of the day that is past. We thank you for this time to be together, to reflect on the life of Mary. We ask in this Advent season, as we approach Christmas, that you help us to open our hearts and minds so that we may prepare a place for you to be born again in us and in our world. And we ask this for love's sake. Amen. And with that, happy to invite forward Angela Mack.
Well, thank you all for coming out tonight. I haven't done this lecture in a long time, so I was brushing up a good bit yesterday and today. I will say that I'm not a theologian, and what I'm going to tell you this evening, or talk about this evening, is information gathered through the study of art history. So I hope that this is a conversation. If you have questions, don't hesitate to raise your hand as I present these objects. But it is divided, my talk is divided into sort of two parts. The first part is the various ways in which the Virgin, the Madonna, is represented in art history. And then the second part is her image through the centuries, from the very beginning, the earliest images of her up until the present. So I'll begin with just sort of a little synopsis of what it means to do, or what it means to represent Mary. In art, a Madonna is a representation of Mary, either alone or with child Jesus. These images are central icons for both the Catholic and the Orthodox churches. The earliest depictions of Mary date from early Christian art, the 2nd and 3rd centuries, found in the catacombs of Rome. These are in narrative context. The classical Madonna imagery develops from the 5th century as the Marian story, or the Marian devotion, rose to great prominence after the Council of Ephesus, formally confirming Mary as the Mother of God, or in the Greek word Theotokos, God-bearer. And this took place in about 431. The Theotokos iconography is, as it developed in the 6th and 8th centuries, rose to great importance in the high medieval period of the 12th and 14th centuries, both in the Eastern Orthodox Church and the Latin spheres. According to a tradition first recorded in the 8th century, and still strong in the Eastern Church, the iconography of images of Mary goes back to an important drawing from life that Luke the Evangelist did and is recognized in many of the early icons of the period. In Western tradition, depictions of the Madonna were greatly diversified by Renaissance masters such as Duccio, Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, Raphael, Bellini, Caravaggio, and Rubens, while the Eastern Church stayed pretty true to sort of the same image of the Virgin over and over and over again. The earliest consistent representations of mother and child were developed in the Eastern European sphere, where despite an iconoclastic strain for a period of time, when pictures were seen as idols, the images persisted in the repetition of a narrow range of types or conventional imagery. And the repetition of these images over and over until to the fact that you see them today. In the West, hierarchical Byzantine models were closely followed in the Middle Ages, but with the increase in importance of the cult of Mary in the 12th and 13th centuries, a wide variety of types developed to satisfy a flood of more intensely personal forms of devotion. In the usual Gothic and Renaissance formulas of the Virgin Mary sits the infant baby on her lap or enfolded in her arms. In early representations of the Virgin enthroned, and the child may be fully aware, raising his hand to offer blessing. In the 15th century, Italian variations include the baby John the Baptist looking on with to the mother and child. Later Gothic sculpture of the Virgin and Child may show a standing Virgin with the child in her arms. Iconography varies between public images and private images supplied on a smaller scale and meant to be for personal use only. And these sometimes will show, for instance, the child suckling the Virgin's breast. But what I'm going to do now is sort of show you the antithesis of Mary, the Madonna, so that we can have context for why her imagery is the way it is. So if you will go to the first slide, Adam. And there she is, the antithesis of the Madonna, our dear Eve, who in this particular image, and let me flip to my other page. By Albrecht Dürer, which was painted in Nuremberg for Rudolph II after he returned from Venice and was influenced by the Italian Renaissance. She is seen as a very voluptuous young woman, of course holding the apple, shown with the serpent, the entire story of the fall of mankind. What you really can't see very well in this image, however, are 4 animals, because it's a little cropped. The animals in the background are the cat, the elk, the rabbit, and the ox. And these animals represent cruelty, melancholy, sensuality, and lethargy. So these are all concepts that are associated to this woman, okay? Do you want to go to the next slide? Thank you. And here she is again in 2 different times in art history. The first is by Gustav Klimt, which in fact is an image of Eve before the fall. The thought is that this painting of Adam and Eve together is right when Eve is being created. However, she is still very voluptuous, very sensual, and represents everything Mary is not. The other is from the Ghent altarpiece by the Van Eycks, And here, while she is showing some modesty, what's interesting is above her head, what do you see? Can you see it? So above her head, as a sculpture, is shown Cain and Abel. And Cain, of course, is killing Abel. So this begins the whole story of the Old Testament and how Eve is the initiator of that entire situation. So now let's move forward, and here we are. And it begins with Mary as a child, which is fascinating. And this Marian story, because we now have to build woman back up again, okay? She is the end of the world, and now she has to be the beginning of the world. So in Giotto's series at the Arena Chapel, or the Scrovegni Chapel as it's called, because he was the benefactor in Padua, one of the early scenes on the virgin side of telling the story in that chapel is this one of Mary being presented at the Temple of Jerusalem to the high priest at the age of 3. And this is to sort of shed light on her capabilities, even as a child, in terms of her intellect and her courage and her importance. So if you go to the next one. And here she is, in the Giotto image, you may have noticed, go back 1 second, Adam. You see how she's being helped by her mother a little bit up the staircase? So in the second image, this one by Titian, she's not being helped. However, in the Marian story, the staircase is referenced. Apparently there were 15 stairs to reach the high priest, to be recognized by the priest. And here she is climbing those stairs all by herself, which is meant to show her capabilities as a young person, even at the age of 3. Yes? Yes, yes. And here even, and you can't see it very well, unfortunately, in the slide, in the Giotto slide, she only has a halo. Here, she is in a total mandala. Like her whole physical being is already blessed. Yes? Well, blue is virginity. That's the color. Not red, and of course white is death, so blue is it. Go ahead. So here is a Russian icon, and what's interesting in this particular image of her is that while the other 2 images show the Virgin Mary as a child, in the Russian Orthodox Church, she is a full-fledged adult, even when she's being presented to the high priest at the age of 3. She's just in miniature. So this concept of her adulthood is being presented right at the start of her life in terms of being fully capable of doing anything that an adult could do. Go ahead. The next moment in time that's focused on with Mary, of course, is the Annunciation. And here we have 2 images by Fra Angelico, who really just went wild with the Annunciation. I'm not sure exactly how many he did, but there were quite a number. And we have sort of an evolution of how he's working, how he's using symbols when you look at all of his Annunciation pieces. The upper piece on the left actually ties the Annunciation, of course, to the expulsion of Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden, which you see on the far corner. The ray of light, however, that comes obviously from God, who is not only expelling Adam and Eve, but also shining the light of new birth towards Mary. So it's this dichotomy of thinking about the past, but visually recognizing that Mary is the salvation, not only of the world, but of women. Her hand is held up sort of in this posture of surprise, so that, because if you remember the scripture, she is taken by surprise by the angel Gabriel, because he comes and tells her that she is pregnant with the Christ child. In the lower figure, interestingly, Fra Angelico begins to introduce some symbolism that perpetuates throughout the Renaissance and into later years. In this corner right here, you see a window, and unfortunately you can't see it very well, but the window is barred. It has a crosshatch of bars set in the window. And this, of course, implies that this is a virgin birth, that she was never impregnated, but that the child was, immaculately conceived. So this is some of the early images of that concept of immaculate conception that you see in the 15th century. So Leonardo comes into the picture, and of course, having his classical training and his interest in the classics and referring back to many of the images that the Greeks and Romans had created and were being discovered at this point, his very symmetrical approach to the Annunciation is true perfection in terms of the triangular image. He sets the scene in what looks like a Garden of Eden, even though it seems like an Italian background, but still it's meant to present that. At the same time, we begin to see the introduction of people's devotion. So, for example, the table that she sits at is meant to represent the sarcophagus of Pietro da Cosimo, which of course was the leader or the important individual and patron of the arts in Florence when Leonardo da Vinci was working there. It also happens to be a work of art that his teacher, Andrea del Vecchio, was also carving at the same time when he was working in his studio. So the symmetry of it, the pastoralness of it, but there's very little sort of interaction between the two. She is lit up clearly from sort of this fire or this aura from within. Her hand is up sort of in surprise that Gabriel has come and visited her, but there's very little emotion that is portrayed. So go to the next one. Now, Botticelli takes a little bit of a different tact in terms of this same scene. Again, we have a beautiful setting through the window in the back. Surprisingly enough, it looks like now we are definitely in Italy as opposed to somewhere, in the Middle East. And certainly the angel is becoming a lot more exuberant and forward in terms of the interaction with Mary. This particular piece, I think, is sort of the beginning of the conversation of when the Immaculate Conception takes place. Because not only is Mary, frightened and pulls back, but she's also in this sort of swooning posture, like, uh-oh, something's happened to me. And Botticelli is trying to convey that in this particular work. Here she does have red on, Martha. That could be a symbol too. I bet there are paragraphs written about that one. Go ahead.
Angela?
Yes.
The Bible never says that there was an immaculate conception. Where did that person?
Adam.
Either way, you can tell. I'm just asking.
Well, I do think that it was the Roman Catholic Church that begins to elevate Mary. And I think as sort of a counterpoint to Eve, in some ways, the way Jesus
David, yes.
It's not correct that it was not Jesus that was conceived immaculately, but Mary.
Oh, that too. Oh, for sure. Interestingly. Any other questions? I'm sure there are whole seminars on the Immaculate Conception that we that we could participate in.
Made the situation occur.
No. He was just the informer. He was the teller.
Yeah.
But the question is, did it happen when she was told? Is that the image that's being conveyed? Do you want to go back to it for a second?
Happened when Gabriel arrived.
So is that the concept that's being, yeah, right. So, if that's the case, then how do you reflect that in art? The ray of light, for sure, certainly. In this particular instance, and remember that, the Renaissance period was all about discovery and recognition of the human and making things humanized. So is Botticelli trying to make this, in this godly situation, more human? And I think to a certain extent he is, because at the end of the day, these images were not only meant for the patrons who wanted to find a place in heaven, but they were also meant to convey information to a large population that couldn't read. And therefore, creating images that conveyed complex concepts was very important. Yes? Can you repeat that? Because I can't.
Botticelli is also very interested in this, in the formation of movement, and the very fixed movement of the plane. So perspective, we see the lines in the floor, we see the very fixed window, the landscape versus being in the background, but here we have almost a slow motion.
Exactly.
Rather than standing up, it's kneeling, almost crouched. The moment that super is in forward, you see that continuation.
In her body. It's almost like a crescendo in music, just sort of this swooping movement that you see next to, let's say, Leonardo's static approach, his very formal approach. So, the next image is that of the Visitation. And here again, we have a situation of Elizabeth, the mother of John the Baptist, Mary, who is now also pregnant. Both of them are pregnant women. And this recognition not only of the two of them as being blessed, but also, in some ways, the first meeting of the two people that they carry. So in that regard, this particular image, which shows this mystery taking place, is also related to the statement that Elizabeth made with regards to her exclaiming, "Blessed are you among women, and blessed is the fruit of your womb." And is that in Luke, I believe? Yeah. So here we have that joining of these two women, Elizabeth representing the Old Testament, Mary representing the New Testament, and this moment in time that is part of the Marian cycle of her life. Go on to the next one. Now, here's another, again from the Eastern Orthodox Church, that represents the same story, but with an affection and a relationship that in many ways is far more human than what you just saw. I mean, the two women are actually hugging each other, embracing each other, and knowing that their relationship is similar but different at the same time. You want to go to that? So now we move forward to Leonardo, and I'm sorry, but this is about the best you can do with this particular image. It is a work that was unfinished. It's the earliest extant work that he completed in Florence before he left to go to Milan and work for the Struzzis. It shows, and it's now at the Uffizi, of course, but it shows Mary in a Garden of Eden-like area. The angels hold, it's, oh, I'm sorry, I think I have this. Did you skip forward? No? Let me see. No, there she is. Okay, I apologize. I got ahead of myself a little bit there. Yes. So now we jump to the Adoration of the Magi, and this is the piece that we're looking at now with Leonardo da Vinci. It's an unfinished work. It was the first one, or the last piece that he did when he was in Florence. And it shows sort of a compilation of all the stories that relate to the Adoration of the Magi. Basically, what Leonardo has done in this painting is that he has thrown in everything but the kitchen sink. The shepherds are there. There are various people in there that we don't know exactly what their job is, but it does create sort of this relationship to a historical concept of the Nativity and places the Virgin in what at the time was thought to be or represented more of a real setting for the adoration. It sadly was never finished. It's not in great shape. It is at the Uffizi, and studies continue to be done in terms of x-rays to sort of understand all the people that are depicted. Do you want to go to the next one? Bruegel, on the other hand, takes a different tact with the Adoration of the Magi. Here, his work is very realistic, almost grotesque in many ways in terms of the way that he represents the figures in the group. The Magi are represented as the three ages of man: old, middle age, and young, and the three continents that were known at the time: Europe, Asia, and Africa. There are also soldiers that we don't quite understand why they're there, but it could have reference to the various issues that the Spanish Netherlands were going through during this particular time in the 16th century. Interestingly, the Joseph, who is right here, and you can't really see it, but the donkey is back here. His facial expressions and the donkey's facial expressions are often talked about in the same breath. He has sort of a dumbness about him that is really kind of interesting, sort of this being totally unaware of what's going on right in front of him. And I'm not sure that we understand that, representation of Joseph in this way. Thank you. Now, with El Greco, we take the adoration of the shepherds to a whole new level, and to the point where I think we all realize this is an image of total and utter ecstasy, which El Greco was really good at. He could make things so surreal in his images, and certainly with the Magi, with the shepherds, he has done that. The illumination, the elongation of the bodies, you have no sense of where this is taking place in terms of the background. It is truly meant to be a spiritual image, and interestingly enough, he created it specifically to go over his tomb before he died. It was the last work he created before his death. So that too could have played a big factor in how he represented this particular scene. So now we move on to the flight into Egypt. And here again we go back to Giotto and the Arena Chapel, showing a very simple, somewhat populated flight into Egypt, straightforward from the early Renaissance period, and representing the angel protecting the family as they are making their way. Of course, this story stems from the fact that eventually Herod found out about the birth of Christ. He ordered all firstborns to be killed. Therefore, Mary, Joseph, and the baby left Bethlehem and made their way away. We're not exactly sure where they went after that because the story kind of goes dead.
The Egyptians have lots of answers.
The Egyptians, that's right. Somewhere in Egypt. But interestingly, he's got these erroneous people in this parade that we're not quite sure who they are and what their purpose is. Go ahead. Then with Botticini, with Fabrino, we have a much wider expanse of this story. Again, we're not exactly sure where we're located. It does seem to be somewhat of an Italian-esque scene. We have fewer people involved, but it does sort of create the expanse of their flight. And they're leaving Bethlehem to escape the dangers of Herod. This was part of a larger altarpiece on the adoration of the Magi. And not only is this scene shown, but also a new scene that creeps in at this point in time, which is called the Rest to the Flight of Egypt. So if you'll go to the next slide. And this is one of those scenes by Michelangelo. So this actually depicts an image of Joseph, Mary, and Jesus taking a rest on their way on this trip to Egypt. Interestingly, there's no, as I said before, there's no reference to this in the story, in the Marian story at all, or in the Bible, but the assumption is that they did rest here or there. Very humanization of the rendering, a playful baby, a serious father, an adoring mother. But interestingly, in this view of the family, unlike what Bruegel did, Joseph is above Mary. And if you look at the way he's seated, he's actually cradling her between his legs. And then the baby is sort of crawling away or doing what babies do. So this type of humanization, this creation on the part of Michelangelo of a real family, a protective father, an adoring mother, is coming into the art world as we progress on the story of the depictions of Mary. Next one, please. Then we fast forward, and this is an interesting take on the flight into Egypt by Henry O. Tanner. He was an African-American artist who studied in Paris in the early 20th century. He left this country declaring that he couldn't take the prejudices of America, much like many African-American artists who either went up north and became part of the Harlem Renaissance or traveled abroad to get away from the South. His father was actually a bishop in the African Methodist Episcopal Church. And therefore, this theme, as well as other religious themes, were images that he created repeatedly. He painted this scene from a very personal standpoint, and particularly with regards to the concept of the Great Migration of African Americans leaving the South after World War I. So now it takes a very different impression in terms of what the flight into Egypt really means to African Americans, particularly in the 20th century. So now we move to the Assumption, which is something we were talking about before this lecture started. And of course, Botticelli does a grand job in this wonderfully populated portrayal in a church in Florence. It's an altarpiece in Florence, and now actually it's in the National Gallery in London. But here you have the donors, who are represented at the bottom on either side, kneeling as they watch this entire Assumption scene. You have the dead being resurrected. You have all of the saints, all of the angels, 9 choirs of angels and saints. The question is, did this happen? No. And in some ways, it even puts a question mark on Botticelli's understanding of the Bible as well as the donors, because this concept of all of these people together during the Assumption isn't even written anywhere. So it's their rendition of what, or the artist's rendition along with the donors, of what may have occurred. And here are some additional Assumption scenes, one by Titian, one by Vecchio, that really brings home this concept of the Virgin Mary rising up into heaven in a godlike manner. Her resurrection, essentially, which is what is being portrayed here, is something that the Catholic Church was very much interested in, but not the Orthodox Church. And in fact, when I went back to sort of try and figure out when this concept of the Assumption and then eventually the Immaculate Conception took hold with the Catholic Church, it really didn't happen until 1854. And of course, the Protestant Church doesn't believe in the Immaculate Conception. But these are 2 very strong images of what the Catholic Church was trying to achieve and the veneration that they were trying to create for the Virgin Mary. If you want to go to the next one. And then here we are with the Immaculate Conception, one by Piero Cosimo, and the other by Ribera, really showing the moment in time. And now we don't have an angel, we don't have a story, we don't have anything. We have Mary at the moment when she conceives Christ and what that potentially looked like, or how it's portrayed in art. The Orthodox Church doesn't believe in this. And this is, to some extent, a time when the 2 churches really sort of separated in terms of their dogma and their approach. But often now in many Italian churches, you will see this Immaculate Conception moment depicted through art. Yes? Yes. Holy Ghost. Yep. And this one doesn't, this has angels all through it. Angels are everywhere in this one. Here you do have people, most likely the various people in her life, like Elizabeth, Joseph, etc.
So that is Joseph present.
Well, you know, he was a bystander.
So my question to you, down here on the
Voice of God. Yeah.
So were like crosses big before the introduction of like Christ? Because there seems to be a lady in the front row holding a preordained cross.
On which image?
Cosimo?
Cosimo?
Yes.
Aha, I do see it. Yeah, she's kneeling and she has the cross in her hand. You know, that's a good question. I mean, you mean in terms of having it as an amulet, or?
Yeah, I mean, if this is a depiction of the scene, like, he's not even...
He's not even
right?
dead yet.
Yeah, he isn't crucified, so like,
Right.
what's the cross for?
Well, you know, honestly, I think with some of these concepts, and particularly, you know, in the 16th century, it's like, let's throw as many symbols as we can in there so that the point isn't lost.
Yeah.
It's like foretelling his destiny.
Yeah,
Of course.
I do think that there's a lot of theological iconography and thinking that does try to link the birth of Jesus with Jesus' ultimate destiny, right? His death and resurrection. And there's some, you know, lore that the wood of the crib was also the wood of the cross, right? And
yeah.
all those connections.
Yeah. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
All right, so on to the next. Here are some more images of the Immaculate Conception. This does become a very popular image in the Catholic Church, and certainly was done by almost every important artist, a Rubens piece, a Murillo piece, that just sort of takes, again, this theme of going from sinful Eve to perfection with Mary.
Is that why there's a snake in the one on the left?
You bet. You bet. And she's trampling it. Then finally, in terms of Mary's life, what we see over and over again, and particularly in the Orthodox Church, is this cycle of life story. So not only do you have the traditional Virgin in the center with the mandorla in a position of blessing, but then all around her in scenes, whether it's an altarpiece or the icon itself, you have all of the stories that I've just mentioned to you as part of the individual scene. And you know, it can take numerous forms, even to the point where they are just entire iconoclasts that relate specifically to the Mary story. Birth, presentation, assumption, Annunciation, visitation, flight into Egypt, and then eventually Assumption. So all of these get combined into sort of presenting her as an individual. So now I'm going to take a minute, and now we're going to look at everybody sort of over a 3,000-year time lapse. Because where does this imagery really come from? Do we actually believe the story that the image of Mary was done during her lifetime by Luke the evangelist? And certainly there's a lot of skepticism around that. However, there are ancient images of very sort of important women and pious women and women who were really good in ancient history, from which the image of Mary comes. So, for example, these prototypes, I think, are excellent examples of where her look essentially came from. And this is a piece, a matron sculpture from ancient Greece, and I'm sure many of you have seen these, particularly as funerary images in graveyards and what have you, that were done when a great woman passed away, with the mandala or the headpiece around her head, the drapery around her body. When you look back on some of the images that we've already seen, it's a dead ringer for what was being done in ancient Greece and ancient Rome before the birth of Christ. Go ahead to the next one. And here we have a matron with her son. Again, this is most likely taken from a burial ground, but in this case it is Cornelia, who was considered the greatest of great Roman women during the Roman Empire because she sacrificed everything in her life to support her two sons. Her older son died tragically, but then she devoted herself to her second son, who then went on to become one of the great Gracchi family members and were actually the founders, pretty much the creators of the Roman Empire. So she was revered in classical Rome in the classical period. And here we have an image of her with her son that begins this concept of how do we depict a great and loving woman. Go on to the next one. Then we start to look at some of the images that were early on. So for example, this piece of the Virgin and Child is actually from the Catacombs of Priscilla, dated 150 BCE, and shows a woman cradling a child. Here we may have the image of a godlike figure, sort of blessing the two. But here's your first sort of indication of a mother and child image, much like what we just saw in the sculpture piece. Go ahead to the next one. These two images again. The first is a first century that shows from the Dura Europa in Syria and is now at Yale University, this one here. And then a scene of an Annunciation from the 12th century from a Byzantine illuminated manuscript. So at these very early times, you see her image being solidified and repeated, and the iconography actually created. You'll go on to the next one. Now we see her in 600 AD, where she is surrounded by two saints, George and Theodora, and this is at the St. Catherine's Monastery in Mount Sinai. And so her imagery is beginning to solidify during these early years, the late years before Christ, and then the early years after Christ. Go ahead. And now we look at the two pieces that are thought to be the originators of her imagery. An icon, which is thought to be the one painted by St. Luke, and then the other is the icon of St. Luke actually being painted. So here we have the image that is thought to be the original image of the Virgin, and here we have an image of St. Luke actually creating that image. It's fascinating that this story becomes part of the iconography of her. Then we jump forward to the vestibule at Hagia Sophia in Istanbul, where we have a full-fledged version, including the saints of the mother and child in this seated grandeur of her as Queen of Heaven. Sculpture pieces, too, that relate to her relationship with the Christ child, both as a mother from a Renaissance work of art that shows her much more realistically, but early Renaissance, and then this piece, this is a Norman piece from France that has her very rigid, but yet at the same time her loving protection of the Christ child. And this one is about the strangest image I think I have ever seen of the Mother Mary, God, the child is there too. I mean, everything that you can imagine. It is actually a sculpture piece that opens up. So literally you are talking about opening up Mary and seeing God and the child in her body. And of course, the Germans made it. Go on to the next one. So again, we have an image of St. Luke drawing the Virgin by Roger van der Weyden in 1435. And this concept that all of these images are really true to life, that this story is real, and that it's important to the Christian religion. Go on to the next one. Of course, no one paints the Virgin and Child better than Botticelli. The diaphanous veil that she wears, the beautiful see-through mandala on her head as well as on the head of Christ, this realistic or more realistic approach to mother and child actually engaging each other as they read the scripture together. We move on, of course, to the Sistine Madonna by Raphael. Actually, two Sistine Madonnas, where we have the wonderful putti at the bottom that are so well known in art history, the introduction of John the Baptist into this story as well. But these are the images that we mostly think about when we think of the Madonna. Parmigianino, of course, adds his twist to the story by his elongation of the Virgin and Child. Interestingly, this too is a precursor of his death, because if you look at the child, even though he is supposedly asleep, he really looks like he's dead. El Greco, of course, again, this is an image that was most likely done for an individual because it does show the Mary actually suckling the child. This was not an image that was usually used in churches or in public places, but more for private devotion. Bouguereau from the late 19th century adopts the same imagery. Here, very much neoclassical style, very symmetrical, and in sort of this glow of sanctity that's created by this particular artist. And of course, you have the lily everywhere. Kath Kollwitt, German artist from from just before World War II, and a very tragic image of the Pietà. Showing the death of Christ and he enfolded in her arms. Juan Logan, an African-American artist who uses the Madonna in his images of Mammy and creating images that combine the Mammy face with that of the Virgin. And then the last artist I'm showing is Hung Lee, who is actually a Chinese artist. She just passed away in 2021, but she lived all of her life in China. She went through the revolution and created images that reflect specifically on women. If anything, she was a feminist artist in China. Was arrested many times. She was actually a winner of one of the major fellowships in this country, I believe a Guggenheim Fellowship. But she shows the Black Madonna in contemporary garb, cradling a child, and I think sort of brings back full circle the whole conversation of the church and women, and how they play a role in a structure that is predominantly male. So that's the end of my story. I've brought you up to 2016. So any questions? Oh, come on.
I always saw lily, but it was interesting, the ones that you picked didn't show that many lilies. That's
The
why I
ones-
always have lilies.
Yeah, the ones that had, the two that I did show earlier to this last one were the Annunciation scenes, where the angel is carrying the lily as a representation of purity, and it just so happens it also is the flower of Florence. So, you know, for Leonardo da Vinci particularly, it played a dual, you know, it had a dual meaning. Yes? The one in the catacombs. That is the very earliest that we know. Yes. Oh, no, it was 150 BC.
I was surprised it wouldn't be made in Turkey or Ephesus or.
Not that they've discovered. Not that they've discovered. And you know, I think there are scholars that still question that. You know, you have a woman with a baby. Do we just assume?
So I had a question about the El Greco painting that he made before he died, hanging above his tomb.
Yeah, it's eerie, isn't it?
Did it actually get hung above his tomb, or it's somewhere now, or?
No, I think now it's at the Prado, but it was hung above his tomb. It was. Any other questions? Yes?
You didn't show me paintings of the crucifixion. I was curious about,
Well, the crucifix,
role was
yeah.
played during that.
And someone else asked me that question too. It's not a part of the Marian cycle. It's more the story of Christ, and she's, you know, a sub-character, as opposed to she being the main character. And I think that's the reason. It's only a few artists that really do the Pietà, obviously Michelangelo, but they're not, as far as I know, they're not that many in terms of artists.
What's interesting is I have seen modern representations of the Pietà that have been very subversive to, for instance, lift up, you know, the pandemic of gun violence in the country, you know, trying to,
yeah.
you know, place Mary in the position of a mother who's lost a child to,
Right.
to violence.
Well, and that's exactly what Kath Colwitt was doing. Because, you know, when she did that sculpture piece, it was after World War I. You know, Germany was disastrous. It was, you know, we're heading towards Nazi Germany. And you know, this was a very dark time in her career. And the pain in this piece, I'm sorry that this isn't, I've seen much better images of it, and the pain in this work and the contortions of her body, Mary's body around the Christ child's body is really quite moving.
Where is this piece right now?
I'm trying to remember, I think it's, I can't remember at the moment. I think it's in Berlin, but I can't remember which museum. Well, the one Logan is at the Gibbs. That belongs to us. The Mammy scene